What's up, everybody? Welcome to the very first Loganbuilt podcast. I've been wanting to do a podcast style video really ever since I started doing YouTube stuff, but I just never really felt like I had the audience at the time or the following, whatever you want to call it, that anybody would really care enough to do. And now I feel like I've gotten starting to build up a little bit of a platform here. It's just something that I've always wanted to do, so you know what, I'm going to go for it. It might be a total fail, but like anything in life, nothing is worth doing without risk. So the premise of this podcast is going to be a little different than what most podcasts are. It seems like most podcasts, they're trying to get the most important people or the coolest people or the people with the biggest following in to interview them. And I want to go the exact opposite direction of that. I actually want to build this podcast style platform up to give a platform to the average guy that probably isn't ever going to get on another podcast, to have a place to come on, sit down, and tell his or her story about what got them into diesels, what got them into racing, what got them into automotive in general, and just have a place for them to tell their story. So we'll see how that works out. If you're local to this area, the Northern Kentucky, Greater Cincinnati area, and you want to come sit down and talk, get with me, shoot me a message. My plan is today I'm just going to do a podcast about myself. So there's a lot of people that are new to the channel or maybe only know me through YouTube and don't know all of my backstory. I just started doing YouTube in 2020, so I haven't been in this space for a super long time, and I'm 30 years old, so I've done plenty of living before YouTube. And so I just thought maybe it'd be cool to give you guys a rundown of my background, how I got to this point, and where my roots really tie into racing from. And then from there, I'm going to have some of my immediate friends and family on, people that have been in my life during this diesel racing journey, people that do diesel stuff themselves, people that do racing stuff themselves, and get a bunch of different outlooks and explain what their roles were during my life and how it got me to this point. Like anything in life, life itself takes an army. So I definitely didn't get to this point on my own, and I'm not going to get beyond this point on my own either. It takes every single person involved in my life. So I'm going to hopefully create an outlet to give the people in my life a platform to tell their story. And then hopefully we will get some new people on here telling their stories. Ideally, I'd like to get some of my customers on here. I've got some customers with some really cool stories that are doing really neat different things. So really right now, this is an open invite to pretty much anybody and everybody. Not saying that we won't get some bigger name people or maybe some shop owners on in the future, but the main goal with the channel here is a storytelling experience. And then you know how storytelling is. You always end up learning something along the way. And I know that by doing this, I'm going to learn something. So really looking forward to doing this podcast stuff, finally pulling the trigger on it. So I guess we'll get started on this first one here by talking about me a little bit. So a little bit strange to go back and recall your life without somebody asking you questions about it. So we'll just start from the beginning here. And really to start from the beginning of my life and how it ties into racing, you really have to go way beyond my life. And you've got to go back to my grandpa's life, specifically on my mom's side. These trophies that are here are his. And these trophies are really where my racing roots are. So my grandpa, his name was Robert Stahl, and he started racing in the early 60s. Drag racing in general, was really formed in the mid 50s. I believe NHRA started actually having events around 1955. Our local drag strip, Thornhill Drag Strip, actually the shirt that I'm wearing, it's the oldest continuously ran drag strip in the country, and they opened in 1955. This trophy over here is from 1962, if you can see that. And it's got my grandpa's name on it and the class that he ran. So my grandpa had been drag racing since the beginning of drag racing, really, just a few years in. And back then, drag racing looked a little bit different than it does today. Back then, there wasn't necessarily bracket racing. There wasn't necessarily index style classes and stuff because it was so new. They had different classes divvied up in what they call gases. So there's A gas, which would be at that time was the fastest of the fast. That's your tubular dragster style stuff. Running on nitromethane, stuff like that. B class was like the next step down from that. Still a full blown race only type vehicle, but maybe not running on nitro. I don't know exactly the definitions between the classes back then at that time period. I kind of only have what my grandpa told me to go off of. And then C class was more of like your really hot rodded up street car. And then D gas was more of your mild type of streetcar stuff back then. And so the class that he actually ran both C and D class. But this particular trophy here, I believe it says that it's from August 6th, 1962, and he was running C gas. So C gas at that time, from what my grandpa was explaining to me, it ran somewhere in the 11s. It couldn't exactly recall if he was running 1120s or 1150s, but he's thinking that that's around the range that he was running in back in 1962. And of course, that's quarter mile back then. Eighth mile was considered half of the racetrack at that point. So in 1962, even if it was an 1199, that is really, really fast for a car that he had actually drive on the street. And he has some really cool stories about changing the rear gear in the car because it was his daily driver for a long time. And he would, put a highway gear in the car, like say a 350 gear in it, to drive it back and forth to work. And then Friday night, he would take the rear end out of it. He'd put a 411 gear in it and then go to the local racetrack on Saturday, race it. And then on Sunday, he'd have to switch it back over to be able to drive the thing to work every day. So really cool. Man, I wish that I could have got to live in the 60s and the 70s. I feel like the racing was so different back then. It wasn't so much about money. It was more about smarts and how hard you worked. He told me some stories that one of his buddies that he raced with worked at Procter and Gamble, which is a big company here local in Cincinnati, and they actually built a sheet metal intake for the car that they were running. And my grandpa always had a Tri-5. He always had I believe it was a '56 Chevy, and that was his race car. And it was always a small block, and they built a sheet metal intake for this thing in the early 60s. I mean, I remember growing up as a kid in the 90s and the early 2000s, and there wasn't cars with sheet metal intakes then that I was around in racing. So pretty cool back then to have something like that. And then this engine was a stroker motor with aluminum rods, and that's pretty mind-blowing too. There wasn't much aluminum rod stuff back in the 60s unless you were really, really serious about it. So Grandpa Bob was definitely very serious about drag racing in the early forms of drag racing, and he won a lot. I have a couple more of these trophies at my shop here. This is our local track, Thornhill. This is one of our other track, Edgewater. There was a track called Tri-State Open back at that time, and he went there and he won at all of them. He has some pretty cool stories about some cheater stuff and how back then, obviously the technology wasn't there. It wasn't like they were going to be able to pump your motor, right, to figure out what cubic inch it was. And a lot of the definitions between these classes back then were based on engine size. So he had some sort of small block. I want to say it was around the 340 inch range. And that would have made it mandatory for him to run C gas. Well, when Seagas, I don't know if it started getting too competitive for him or if he just wanted to have some fun doing this, but he actually would put 302 badges on the car and he would run it in D gas. And back then, they just make you pop the hood. Okay, yep, it's a small block, looks like a little 302. So they let him run in D gas, and then you just go and dominate the field. Nowadays, we would call that puppy kicking, but it's just really cool to hear old racing stories and to know that your heritage goes back as far as basically drag racing itself goes, which is really cool. So then the story continues to get cool. So my dad, he was born in '62. So my dad was actually born while my grandpa was out winning these trophies. And he started racing in the late '70s. He didn't come from a racing background, but he lived right down the road from Thornhill Drag Strip. So it's back in the '70s. There wasn't a whole lot around that part of town, that Morning View, Kentucky, DeMossville area. Probably wasn't much going on down there. So I'm going to venture to say that the drag strip was one of the biggest places that you could be on a Saturday night. And so he had found his way down there as a young kid, right out of high school, and he really took a liking to racing. And sometime in the early '80s, he bought his first, what I would call a real race car. It's a '70 Challenger. If you guys have watched my channel for any length of time, you've seen videos of the car. That is the exact same car. He's had it since the early '80s. I want to say '82 to '84 was around the time period that he bought that car. And back then, you could buy a '70 RT Challenger big block car for $2,500. So if you know anything about Mopars, you know that is a quite desirable car. And if you could buy those for $2,500, you'd buy every one you can now. But it was when he bought it, it was actually a really nice car. He bought it from, I want to say, the second or third owner. He got it from a guy named Kevin Beach. And the car was all original aside from the engine. It originally had a 383 in it, and he pulled, not he did, somebody had pulled the motor out and put a 440 6-pack in it when he got it. But at that time, he knew where the original engine was still. So, in hindsight, looking back, if you were trying to have a really nice original car, it had the possibility of being that back then. But like all of us, or a lot of us, he didn't really care about that. He just cared about drag racing. So he started racing the car, started doing all the stuff you do back in the early '80s. You go get the Mopar Performance book that a lot of the older guys consider the Bible, and you start building a car based off of that. And back then, you got to think, there's no internet, there's no YouTube videos. You can't just go out and just easily find information about how to build a race car. So books were a big thing back then. And this Mopar Performance book that they all call the Bible was really about your only step-by-step how-to build a race car. And it had it all laid out in categories. So, like, let's say if you wanted to run 11s in the quarter, it had a build list of what you would do to run 11s. If you wanted to run 10s, it had a build list of what you wanted there. 9s, and then it even had it in the 8s, which 8s were really fast in the '80s. I mean, 8s are still fast today, but in the '80s, I mean, that's a full-blown race car back then. That's a pro stock car back in the '80s. And so the funny thing about this was, though, is that if you talk to most of these older Mopar guys, they'll all tell you that if you wanted to run 10s, you better do everything that the 9-second category tells you, because usually it was about a second off. Now, knowing what I know now, maybe that was because the guys didn't really understand a lot about suspension back then. I actually read through those books when I was a kid, so I can't say that I know exactly what's in them. It's been a long time, but I don't recall there being a ton of like really good suspension knowledge in it. So who knows? Maybe the horsepower was there to run in the 9s, but maybe these guys just weren't chassis guys enough to get them there. But it's kind of the running joke that if you wanted to build a 10-second car, you better go off of what the 9-second guide tells you. So my dad starts transitioning this car over from a street car into a real deal race car. And at that time, locally to them, so they're bracket racing at this point. And if you're not familiar with bracket racing, essentially it means that you take a time lap down the track, and whatever the car runs, let's just say in his case it was 1250s, right? So if it ran a 1251, well, then you could dial in at a 1251, and if your car repeated that lap again, that's what it would run. So basically, it opens it up to where it doesn't matter how much power you have, anybody can race. So if you have a car that it'll only go, say, 17 seconds in the quarter mile, you can still race an 11 or 12-second car and have a chance of beating them. Basically, if you're the slower car, you get a head start. The faster car sits on the starting line for that amount of time. That is the difference between the two dial ins, and then they go. And then whoever has the best reaction time and whoever is as close to the number that they dialed in at is going to win that race. So that's what was popular back then. And so the first rendition of my dad's car, to the best of my knowledge, it ran somewhere in the 12s. The 1230s to 1250 range, if I remember correctly, which was pretty much about the going rate back then. That's what cars are running. They're still running quarter mile back in the 80s. It hasn't all switched over to eighth mile yet. And he starts getting more and more serious into racing. He starts putting a cage in the car. It's still on leaf springs at this point. Back then, the big thing were super sock springs. So he's doing the trickery stuff. He's trying the pinion snubbers, all of the old classic Mopar stuff, and he ends up getting the car to run in the 11s. And I believe at the time he was going as fast as around 1130s. We'll have to get him on here and confirm all of this, but he was somewhere in the lower 11s is what he was running with the car. And the fastest cars around that time that were racing at Thornhill, at least, were in the 10s, 1080s, 1070s cars. So he definitely wasn't the fastest guy around, but he was in the conversation with them. And so he continued on racing that car, just improving it a little bit at a time. Redid the cage, gets ladder bars put on it, and I come into the picture in 1993. Well, but before I come into the picture, though, we got to stop because wait a minute, my grandpa on my mom's side was racing. Now we're talking about my dad racing. Well, that means that my dad must have met grandpa's daughter. And the funny story about that is they actually met at the racetrack at Thornhill, the shirt that I'm wearing today, which is pretty cool to say that, both of your parents came from racing and they met at the racetrack, and that I'm a direct descendant of that. So, as a racing guy, I think that's pretty cool. But my mom, her brother, who's my uncle now, had a race car. So grandpa's son raced, and my mom would go and support him. And then my dad was actually friends with my uncle, Bobby Stahl. And so that's kind of how my mom and my dad met. So they meet at the track. They ended up obviously getting into a serious relationship. They get married, and then they have me in 93. So my dad briefly actually does sell the car. Between, I believe it was about 95, he sold the car because he thought that it would be more responsible of him as a young father to not be racing and to do more family style stuff. And he sells the car for about 2 years. And we didn't, we got into camping. I don't remember much of it. I was obviously 2 or 3 years old at this point, and it just wasn't for us. Once you're a drag racer and once you've been bitten by that bug, you can never get away from it. That's why when you see drag racers retire, you'll never find them at the racetrack again, because it's like a drug. You got to stay away from that thing when you quit. If you're quitting, you got to quit. And so my mom and him just missed racing, and so they wanted to get back into racing. Well, lo and behold, my dad's car pops up for sale again. And the crazy thing about it is they were selling it for basically the same price that he sold it for. And when we went to look at the car, I actually remember going and looking at the car. They hadn't changed anything about the car. There was one thing that my dad recalls that they changed. It was something stupid. Maybe the shifter. I can't remember. But for the most part, the car was exactly the same as it was when my dad sold it. So he buys the car back. And then this time around, he's going to redo the car into the next rendition, which is basically how it is even to this day. So him and some buddies of his, Terry Baker, and they cut the car up and they reback half the car. And another buddy of theirs, Jeff Stamper, comes over, and Terry Baker and Jeff Stamper helped my dad completely redo this car. They put a brand new 850 cage in it. They redo the back half, and they do all the tin work in it. My uncle Bobby actually was pretty good at some sheet metal work, so he did a lot of the interior tin work, the door panels. He made the dash for it. My dad is a painter by trade. He's been a painter since he was 18, 19 years old. And he completely repaints the car. He puts fiberglass fenders on the car, and he builds a brand new 500-inch motor for it. Which, if you're not familiar with the Mopar stuff, that's a stroker 440 basically. He puts a set of aluminum cylinder heads on it. You know, all the top notch stuff that you would do for bracket racing. And at this time, this is the early 2000s. This is 2000 to be exact. And he gets the car completed and at the racetrack in 2001. And like I said, for the most part, what you see of the car today is exactly what it looked like in 2001. The only thing that's really changed over the years is just a different hood. But he gets the car to the track, and within the first couple of passes with the car, it runs in the nines. It runs 980s, and at that time, it was running about 640s, 630s in the eighth mile. And that's really respectable for really to this day. That's still a typical bracket car. A typical bracket car is going to be 630s to 650s. Really fast bracket cars start from 6.0s to 550s, and when you get into the fives, most bracket cars are not that fast. That few and far between. So pretty respectable car for going on 25 years ago now. And I remember, at that time, so that's 2001. I'm born in 93. So I'm, around 8 years old. I'm starting to be old enough to understand things and old enough to actually help out at the racetrack. And that's where I learned a lot of my checking tire pressure, making sure that the engine temp is good, make sure that, the very, very basic stuff that is really important to know because it's so basic that it's easy to miss if you're new into drag racing. So I kind of cut my teeth as a young kid doing all that stuff. As a bracket racer, you're what they call counting cars. You're basically in the staging lanes and you're trying to figure out which car you're going to run. So you figure out if he's a faster car than you or a slower car than you, so you know how to dial your car. Sometimes if you're running a car that's way faster than you, well, you're going to lead first, and then they're so much faster than you, they have to catch you, right? Well, it's really hard to drive the finish line in bracket racing if you're racing a car that's a lot faster than you because they come around you so fast. So sometimes if you're going to be racing somebody way faster than you, maybe you dial the car down to where it can't run that number, and then you just run it all out and hope that you guessed close enough, basically. So learn, all of the ins and outs of how drag racing works at a very young age. And I think that a lot of people sleep on bracket racing. A lot of people think that bracket racing is something that you do, if you don't have any money, or it's just some, boring entry level thing. But really, the best drag racers have bracket racing backgrounds because it's all about the numbers. It's all about the precision. Every incremental, everything matters when it's talking about bracket racing because you're talking about the margin of victories being thousandths of a second. So everything's on the car have to be super methodical, and the process has to be the exact same every time. And if you start off with that mentality, you end up when you get into heads up or class racing as you get older, you have such a better background to lean on to. And consistency and doing the same thing is everything in racing. So I'm really glad that my formative years were spent around bracket cars and not just all out horsepower and ET, because that stuff can always come later. Horsepower and ET if you have a good, solid understanding of how to do it, you can buy horsepower in ET. If you just have money and you just have horsepower, but you don't know anything else, you have a hard road to walk. So, really happy that I was around bracket racing at such a young age. Now, you're probably assuming that at this point in the story, I tell you that I started racing junior dragsters, but I didn't. Um, I don't know if I loved it enough back then to actually do junior dragster racing. My mom and dad swear that I didn't. My dad has always been a blue collar guy. He's always worked two jobs his whole life. He would work at the Chrysler dealer doing body work during the day. He'd come home and every night he would do side work, body work on the side. So he was always working two jobs and then, going racing on Saturdays. And really, when you're working that much, junior dragsters are a lot of work. From what I know about them now, you really don't have time to run your car and a junior. And they're right. I probably complained too much about the heat when I was younger and stuff like that. And I probably didn't love it enough to have a junior. And then so for me, we keep racing for my whole life. My dad's still doing it to this day. But sometime around the age of 13 or 14 years old, I start to get burnout on the drag racing thing. We never ever traveled. We always raced locally. We pretty much, we really only ran about three different tracks, maybe four, but most of our time was spent at Thornhill. And then occasionally we would have a big weekend where we would go down to Clay City, which is about 2 hours from us. And then I can only remember a handful of times we ever got down to London, which is about 2.5, 3 hours from us. Back then, my dad just had when I first remember, he just had an open trailer and a Chevy square body regular cab truck, and that's what the three of us, my mom and my dad and I, would go race in. And then as I started getting a little bit older, he got an enclosed trailer. When he redid the car the second time around, he got an enclosed trailer, and we still had the same square body Chevy. And so driving 3 hours through the hills of Kentucky with that thing was pretty much a no go. It didn't really have what it took to do it. So very rarely did we ever venture out. It was a lot of local racing, racing the same people over and over again. And at that point, I'm starting to understand a lot of stuff about cars. I'm really getting into cars at that point. And in my head, it's like, well, we're not going faster with this car. What are we doing? We're just racing the same people over and over and over again. So I kind of fell out of love with drag racing, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And I fell in love with show cars. I've always been a Mopar guy through and through. I will always be a Mopar guy. I'll probably never own any truck that isn't a Dodge truck or a Ram truck. It's just who I am. It's my dad was a Mopar guy. He worked at the Chrysler dealer, and so I'm a Mopar guy. And I really fell in love with Mopar show car stuff. And I was getting to that point where, I'm 13, 14 years old, and I'm thinking about driving. I'm going to start driving in a couple of years, and I want to drive an old car. So we go out on a hunt. And I'd kind of been, looking at old cars ever since I was about 12. Back then it was in the good old days where you grab the Auto Trader magazine, you flip that thing through and you look for an old car on there that you call and talk to them about. It's hard road nowadays, man. Everybody knows what they got. They know what everything's worth because of the internet. Back then it was a lot easier to find good deals. And about the time I was 14, or just turned probably 14. I remember it being cold out. we found this car that we had driven by 100 times going to visit my grandma, and it was a Duster, a Plymouth Duster. And my dad stopped in there and talked to him, and he ended up surprising me he bought the car. And back then you could get, this car needed a lot of work, but you could get a Duster for, $2,500 or something like that. And so we go on the venture of restoring this car. And like a lot of things in life, it snowballs out of control. My dad wanted to just rebuild the engine, put a paint job on the outside, and roll on with it. I was in show car mode, and I'm a 14-year-old kid with nothing but time and no concept of money, and I was ready to build a show car. So I kind of, as we would get into the car more and more, I would talk my dad into doing more to the car. Hey, let's cut the quarter panels off. The rust needs repaired anyways. Well, we'd get one quarter panel cut off and we'd find something else. I'm like, well, let's buy this sheet metal trunk floor. And I invested my entire life into that. I mean, if I wasn't at school, I was trying to find a way to make money. I was mowing yards. I was shoveling snow by hand for people. My dad always, at that time, he would actually build what he called builder cars, where he would buy a totaled car and he would fix it up and then he would resell it. And back at that time, there was good money in doing that. And so he would pay me to, sand bumper covers, detail the cars when they were finished, and that taught me a lot about paint and body work. A lot of people don't know this, but I actually know a lot about paint and body work just because I grew up around it my whole life. And so it didn't matter what I was doing. If I wasn't working on that duster, I was hustling to make money to put it into that duster. So when we would come across, hey, let's put this sheet metal part on it. Let's put this sheet metal part on it. Next thing you know, you turn around and this thing is a full blown restoration. I mean, we got this thing. We built this homemade rotisserie for it that wasn't even a rotisserie. It was like this A-frame deal that the car, we could hoist it up on the side so that way we could work on the underneath of it. And then we end up later down the road buying a rotisserie for it. And so this car ends up full body color. It's a lime green duster, factory paint scheme, and it ends up lime green from the inside out. I mean, the inside of this thing, where nobody's ever going to see, is lime green. The underneath of the body is all body color. It's all lime green. And we go through a complete nut and bolt restoration of this car. Around before the car was actually even painted, so around, when I turned 16 or so, I pretty much figured out that because of the route that I have chosen to go with this car, that I'm not going to be driving it when I got my license. Had we, in hindsight, just slapped a paint job on it, rebuilt the motor, I probably could have been driving it when I was 16, but I'm kind of glad that I didn't. I wasn't the most responsible driver when I was young. And so anyhow, so I meet my now wife, my freshman year of high school, and it turns out that she's a car girl too. Uh, back then when it wasn't cool to be a car girl, like you were weird if you were a car girl. Uh, and her dad was always into cars. He had a '65 Corvette, so we hit it off immediately just because we were both into cars. And so we're together during the process of this car, and then we get this car painted, we're starting to build it. Well, she gets to the point where she's getting closer to driving, and then her dad actually got her a car. So now I'm working on two of these Mopars, and I'm a show car Mopar guy, so I talked them into doing this big rotisserie restoration on this '73 Roadrunner, right? And so basically where I'm going with this is that I was not, at this point in my life, drag racing, I don't even know what it is anymore. I'm a full blown Mopar. If you asked me when I was 16 years old to decode a VIN for you, I could have told you by looking at it what motor was in that car, what production line it was from. Like, I was kind of like Rain Man when it came to that stuff. And it's funny, my uncle-in-law, he always called me Rain Man because of that, because I could always rattle off all this Mopar stuff. So then, I start driving, right? And looking back on it, when you start driving, a lot of things change in your life. Without you even knowing that it's going to happen, you get this sense of freedom and you get this mobility that you had never had before, right? Before, I'm relying on my mom to pick me up and take me places, my dad, other people's friends and stuff. But when you start driving, all of a sudden, things change, right? You start doing stuff you would have never done before. You start going and hanging out with people that you never had the opportunity to hang before. And your time that you had before you were driving starts to dwindle down. So I start working on the car way less. I start spending way more time with Sarah. We start doing things now because we can actually drive and do it. And so, at this point, I'm several years in on the car. Got it when I was 14. I'm let's just say I'm about 17 now. During this time, I've been working on this car hard for 3 years. I'm a young kid. Um, got this girlfriend. I'm in high school, and my direction just starts to kind of drift away. And I didn't have a car to drive because I had put all my money into this Duster. So my dad lets me drive his pickup truck, which at the time was a 2000, 2001, I think. Whatever it was the newer body style interior, so it was definitely newer than a 98. Second gen half ton gas truck, and it was a really nice truck. It was black. It was a club or extended cab, short bed, had the silver on the bottom. Really, really great shape truck. Uh, just all stock other than that. And so, because I'm driving a truck, at this point, I'm not even a truck guy. I'm still a car guy. I don't really care about trucks. Trucks don't really pique my interest. But I'm daily driving this truck. And it's like anything in life. When you're doing whatever it is that you're doing, you're going to just naturally gravitate to other people doing that same type of stuff. And so I kind of start hanging around some other truck people. And when I start hanging around other truck people, I learn about these diesel trucks. And so, this is 2010 at this time. And back in 2010, like in my area, at least in Northern Kentucky, diesels weren't like super popular yet. They were just starting to be on the come up. And I'm a race car background, Mopar diehard. So I like these Cummins trucks, right? But it's a diesel to me. They're weird. I don't know anything about them. All I know is that everything all the old people have always told me. Oh, the diesels are expensive. You can't afford to maintain them. You know how much oil those things take. Just all the negative things about owning a diesel. And so I just assumed that you were kind of like just a farm kid if you had a diesel. Like, oh man, that was the only thing they had to drive was that poor diesel. And so I would at one point consider myself a diesel hater. I remember kind of like when you're a kid, you talk smack to people, and I remember kind of going back and forth with this kid because he had this Power Stroke that he thought was bad news, and I'm a racer, right? So I'm like, there ain't nothing that Power Stroke's going to do that's going to impress me. And so I'm spending more time around these diesel people. I still at this point don't really have any interest in it. I'm still kind of like anti-diesel, but whatever. They're trucks. I drive a truck, so I'm talking to these type of people. And about my junior year, that's when I was able to start doing V school. And so when I'm able to start doing V school, I'm able to basically do like 1 year of V school and then get into a co-op program my senior year, which was all I cared about because all I cared about was making money. And at that time, I still wanted to do paint and body work for a living. So I started off in V school in my junior year. And I remember that when I was always that kid that got to school super early in the morning. I don't know why. I just always have. My parents were always big about making me be punctual. So I was always one of the first kids at school in the mornings. And I remember when I started doing the V school deal, when we would get on the bus to leave midday to go over to the other location where they did that, there was this guy that had this blue first gen truck. It was a diesel, and it was a stock looking truck, and it had a set of what we call wagon wheels on it, and just some ugly white wheels. Goose is gonna be mad at me for calling them ugly, but man, they were just like this thing just looked pappy, just looked like a farm truck. But it was a '92, and it looked like it was from '82, and I immediately caught my attention because I'm a Mopar guy. I'm like, man, that's a cool truck right there. That was the first older body style truck that really had ever caught my eye that I ever actually paid any attention to. And so I would see this truck parked in the parking lot every day when I'd go to V school. And so then I started talking to some people, and I'm like, hey, who owns that truck and stuff. And anyways, end up getting. I don't want to get too much into the story because I'm going to have him on here really soon. But it ends up being my buddy Goose. I end up making friends with this guy. And so really that was my first, okay, let's take a look at this diesel stuff because if I can have a diesel in that truck, that's pretty cool. I like that. So I go through my junior year, and my senior year, I start. I'm able to co-op now, and so I immediately want to co-op at the Chrysler dealer where my dad works. And so I get in that deal, and I start doing that. So I'd go to school half day in the morning, and then the rest of the half a day, I'd be at the body shop working. And there was a kid that worked there at the time. He's older than me, and he had a second gen Cummins truck. P pump. It was a manual. It was a green second gen, and his name was Kyle Walton. And Kyle Walton, I have to really credit him with the whole reason that I really fell in love with diesels. Up until that point, I had just liked this one particular truck that this guy that I now became friends with had at school. But I really didn't know any of the potential of what the diesel truck could do until I met Kyle. And Kyle was very knowledgeable. He was way more knowledgeable than I was. And he, read all the magazines back then, and he knew all about the P pump motors, and he would explain to me the differences between all this stuff. And he kind of took me under my wing and taught me a lot of diesel, performance side of things. And so that totally changed my perspective. I was like, man, that's pretty cool. Like, you're telling me that you can make like 500 horsepower with this? Because you got to remember at the time, my dad's race car had 700 horsepower, and I thought that was crazy. Like, I thought that was big horsepower. The street car that I was building, we were hoping it was going to have 400, and I thought that was going to be a rocket ship. So when he was telling me that you could make 500 horsepower pretty easily with one of these trucks, it had my attention. And so I started hanging out with Kyle all the time, and Kyle's sending me trucks on Craigslist. Back then, Craigslist was the move. We didn't have Facebook Marketplace. And so in late 2011, in December, early December, I find this truck. It's a 93. It was a club cab long bed truck. And I can't remember. I'm pretty sure I found it on Craigslist because that's where I was mainly looking. The Auto Trader stuff was starting to die because Craigslist was taken over at that point. And I remember I found an ad for it. It was a really simple ad. It was up in Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't too far away from here. And it was this black extended cab 93 club cab. And it had a camper shell on it. And so I convinced my dad, hey, Dad, we got to go look at this truck. This thing is super cool. I'm pulling out everything in the book. I'm telling him, hey, if you help me buy this, I'll let you pull your race car trailer with it. All the typical things, right? And for whatever reason, he decided that, okay, let's go up there and take a look at it. And he didn't even bring any money with him because in his mind, he said that he was just basically appeasing me. He had no intentions on buying it, and he figured that it probably wasn't going to be what it was supposed to be anyways. But we get up there and we check this thing out, and it's owned by this older guy, and you could tell he was really meticulous about stuff. It was super clean. It had some rust, but the paint was super nice on it. You could tell it had been repainted at some point. The interior was really mint in it, really nice shape. And the thing that my dad ended up really liking about it, oddly enough, is that he didn't take any of his stuff out of it. So when we went there to look at it, already had this older guy's stuff still in it. And so in my dad's mind, that meant that he didn't need to sell it. He still loved it, and he was just going to sell it if somebody wanted it. So for some reason, my dad decided that he's going to help me out with this, and he was going to help me buy it. This thing was $6,000, and as an 17, 18-year-old kid, I think I just turned 18. I did not have $6,000, so my dad made a deal with me that I would pay him back $250 a week. And when you're, a young kid in school, $250 a week is a lot of money. So I didn't care, though. I wanted this thing so bad. It checked all the boxes for me, which really back then, there wasn't a lot of boxes to check. I just really wanted a first-gen 4x4. I really didn't even want a club cab, but it was, I really wanted a regular cab, but I didn't care. I'd take anything. And black is one of my favorite colors, so it checked enough of the boxes to where I definitely wanted it. So we buy this thing, get it back home, and I'm just, ecstatic about it. And it's right before Christmas, so for Christmas, I asked for some performance parts for it. And I remember my mom and dad got me an exhaust and a fuel pen for Christmas. And man, I thought that just imagine it being your first vehicle, and for Christmas you get performance parts for it. Like, it was awesome. And so Kyle helped me put the exhaust on that thing. We put a fuel pen in it, and it smoked a little bit. It sounded good. It probably only made 30 horsepower more than what it made before, if that. But I was doing something right. So then, I'm starting to get bit by that horsepower bug. So I'm looking, on the forums. I'm researching what I can do to make more power out of this thing. And I actually had like one of those 8-pocket folders, and I would just print stuff off of forums. Firstgen.org was a big forum back then. And I was just like learning everything I could learn about the VE pump. And I was doing like all the cheap stuff. The, 4,200 RPM governor springs, the 3,600 RPM, like doing the fuel screw, just like all that stuff, right? And I really had no business working on this thing. Like, I was not really a mechanic before this. Like, obviously, I'd been around, race cars and stuff my whole life, but like being a diesel mechanic was just this totally different realm for me. And I would always work on the truck on Sundays because obviously, like Friday and Saturday, I'm trying to go cruise this thing. So I had no time for it to be down on a Friday or Saturday. So I'd work on it on Sundays. And it was a running joke for a long time, still even to this day, is my now wife always knew when I worked on the truck on Sunday, because I'd have to come pick her up in my dad's green minivan on Monday to go to school, because I always would break something. It didn't matter what I was doing to that thing. I would screw something up every time I touched it, it seemed like. But, it's funny looking back on it now. And all of those failures, we call them, is what really, teaches you how to do things the right way. So once I had gone through the, all of the cheap power adder stuff, we could say, all the pump work and doing that any which way you can, adding boost gauges and fuel pressure gauges and, putting air dog on it, stuff like that. You get to the point where you got to start spending a little bit of money on it if you want to go any faster. And at that point, I had basically graduated from high school, and there was this event called TS Performance down in Bowling Green, Kentucky, that I had heard of. I don't know if Kyle had ever been or not, but I know that he had heard of it too, for sure. And we heard that, like, that's the one, right? That's a big event to go to. So I really wanted to go check out like what a diesel event was all about. Well, it turns out that fell on the same weekend as my graduation. So we weren't going to be able to skip graduation for that. So had to just hope to go to TS the next following year. So, graduate high school. At this point, I'm working full time now. I'm really not making any money. I was working for $7.95 an hour back then, but I'm full time. I got my own truck. I'm hot rodding this thing, doing some performance stuff to it. Obviously I worked at a body shop, so I wanted to, make the truck look good. And one of the first things that I ever built for it was this cow hood. And I just built it with some Auto Metal Direct, like generic cow. And like looking back on it, I think it's actually kind of ugly now. But back then it was, I guess, pretty cool to have like something that wasn't stock. So it turns out that the memory ran out on the card there. So anyways, I built this cow hood for it. And the show that we ended up deciding to go to, our very first ever event, is the Scheid Diesel Extravaganza. And at this point, I've got a group of friends here that are all into the diesel stuff. They've all got trucks, and so we all convoy up together for the very first time. I had never gone on any sort of trip before at that point on my own, and I had definitely never gone and stayed overnight somewhere by myself. So we go on this big old boys trip up to the Shy Diesel Extravaganza in 2012. And boy, was that an experience, to say the least. That was back when they used to do the Burlington Coat Factory parking lot deal, where everybody would go in there and do big burnouts, and it was just crazy. And I remember thinking, like, this is the wildest thing that I had ever seen. And so, I mean, I was just fired up about diesel stuff. Like, this is awesome. So, you go to an event like that and you see like all the sled pulling and you see all the show trucks, and, you're talking about horsepower, and you see people, talking smack and stuff. And so I'm like, all right, I'm ready to start building some horsepower. And then at that time, like compounds were like really big. Like pretty much anybody that was making horsepower, it seemed like they were doing it with compounds. And so I did the old way, old school HX35 over the HT3B deal. And that I honestly, other than building that cow hood, not much of a fabricator. I mean, I had not really fabricated before I had started on that truck. And so I had done a pretty decent job on the cow hood, and I felt like I was confident enough to where I could do the compound setup. And so I built from scratch my own compound setup, just looking at pictures on the internet, reading the forums back then about how to do it. And so I, built this compound setup on it. And I was always, like I said, I was a show car guy, right? And so I had all of the piping. I painted the piping. It was funny, actually, lime green, because, my duster. And then I painted the valve covers lime green. And then I actually had the all the hot stuff ceramic coated. So like the exhaust manifold, the exhaust housing on the little turbo, the big turbo, the hot pipe. I had all that stuff ceramic coated. And I guess, back then there wasn't a ton of people doing that. And so it looked pretty good. It was amateur. I took it to a guy to have it TIG welded, because I had known that you don't MIG weld that stuff. And I definitely had done my research on it. And I get it all together, and I was expecting this truck to just move out. I'm expecting this thing to be a monster. And I go drive it down the road, and and I floor it, and it's like, man, it really doesn't feel any faster than it was. And I was like really disappointed, because I just gone through all this work. And at that time you could do something like that for like $2,000. And $2,000 is a lot of money when you're a kid. And so I just felt like I had just spent all this money. I had to put head studs in the engine because of that, and did all this work, and had no power. And one of the kids that I ran around with at that time, his name was Austin Dahl. He told me, he said, "Well, yeah, what did you expect? You don't have any fuel to spool it." And I was like, "Well, what do you mean?" Because I didn't know much. So I started looking into it, and it turns out it's like, hey, you add all that air to it, you got to have some more fuel. And I still run in stock injectors. So I put a set of just the cheapest 5x14 injectors that you could buy, which back then were diesel auto power injectors. And I put those in. And at this point, I have met a now longtime friend of mine, Tim Wright. And Timmy he was a little bit older than us, and he was a diesel mechanic for a living, and he had a 12-valve truck that ran really good. And so he did a lot of he was a mutual friend of a lot of us, and so he would help us a lot with our diesel work. And I remember he helped me put the injectors in the truck because I had never done that before. And on the first drive, I was like, holy crap, like what a difference this thing has made just by putting the injectors into it. And so it was fast enough to where I wanted to put a time with it. And so I wanted to go to the racetrack with it. And I had raced it several times, just like, it's high school. Let's go to Edgewater on a Friday night and see what they run type of stuff. I had ran 18s and 17s with the truck, but I knew that it was tremendously faster now, and I wanted to see what it would run in the quarter. Um, and so I took the truck to my local track, and it was a high 14-second truck, around like 1480s, and I thought like this thing is bad, like 1480s is fast is what I'm thinking. And back at that time it was, but I hadn't learned about the common rail yet. All of the people that we ran around with, we were all 12 valves. One was a VP44 truck, and then the other one was a P pump 24 valve. So we were all mechanical guys, and really hadn't known anything about the common rail yet. So I'm really thinking I got something here, and so a little bit more time goes on. I finished that up at the end of the year in 2012. So in 2013, it pops up for that TS event again, and I'm like, hey, I missed that last year. It looks like that's really cool. We should go to that one. And I'm a little bit more interested in like seeing what these trucks run now that I've, put a number with mine and I've got some power going. And I'd seen that was the event to go to if you were interested in watching drag racing. It was the big drag racing event. So, once again, we all plan on, convoying down there and such. But this time, I want to race my truck. And I just bought a brand new set of wheels and tires for it, which back then, like, I don't even know if American Force wheels were a thing. If they were, they weren't anywhere in our neighborhood because we couldn't afford those things. I remember I had a John boat that I had built when I was in middle school, and I had sold that boat to buy the wheels for the truck. So I remember the wheels were not more than $1,500 because that's what I got out of the John boat. And I want to say the tires were like $1,000 back then. And that was for a set of Mickey Thompson, the original ATZs, the really cool one before Mickey freaking quit making all the cool tires. And they were there's an 18-inch wheel, there's a 12-inch wide wheel, and it was a 33 1350 tire. And man, that thing looked mean. When we put there, it was a fuel, I don't even remember, hostage wheel, I think. And the 18 by 12s just looked friggin' good on the truck. And so I want to go to TS and I want to race in the event. I want to run the ET bracket. I come from a bracket racing background. I had bracket raced my mom's Jeep when I was not even had my driver's license, and I did pretty good in that. So, I was looking forward to doing it. And I had done a couple other little upgrade stuff to the truck, the old KSB switch on the Hobbs pressure switch. If you guys have been VE guys for a long time, you know what I'm talking about there. And they also had a dyno down there, and I wanted to dyno the truck to see what it would make. So we actually hauled the truck down there. A buddy of mine, Andy, he hauled it down there for me, and so this was first time I'm ever really racing this truck, and I'm doing it way out of town. My buddy's hauling it. We borrowed a gooseneck trailer from our other buddy. It was his dad's trailer. Like, you know what I mean? Just living life, man. And we go down there, and that's my first real experience with drag racing. Yeah, I told you I went to Shide in 2012, but the way it was laid out, we didn't even know there was a drag strip there. We were all over on the sled pulling side, the show and shine sign, so we didn't see any drag racing over there. So I'd never been to Beachman at that point, and I remember the traffic was just bumper to bumper to get into the actual event. And if you've ever been to Beachman, it's a beautiful facility. You go past these really beautiful old farms on the way in, and it's just these rolling hills and these fields, and it's just awesome. And I remember sitting in traffic like, wow, this is just incredible. This is the craziest thing I'd ever done. And, we go there and we unload the truck. And I remember there was Friday racing and Saturday racing. And on Friday, we did the test and tune, and I went a 1460, and then I went a 1445, which was my personal best at that point. And I was really, really excited about it. Well, like TS used to be plagued for, the rain rolled in and it started raining on Friday. So I got 2 time runs in, and then the event was canceled for the day. So we come back the next day, the Saturday, and I start racing the truck, and I'm starting to go some rounds in it. Back then, you could race, if you knew anything about bracket racing, you could go out there and pretty much get down to 8 trucks every time because there was really only a handful of people that knew what they were doing. And so I'm starting to go through the later rounds, or I'm starting to go through rounds of racing, and this photographer comes up to me, and he just loves the truck. Super nice guy, man. It's just really asking me all kinds of questions. Like I can just tell he loves the truck. And I didn't know who it was at the time, but it's Mike McLaughlin, I think is how you say his last name. Super good dude. Still doing it to this day. And he says, "Hey man, I love the truck, and I want to do a photo shoot of it. Do you have time?" And I'm in between rounds of racing right now, but I don't care. Like this guy is a magazine guy, and he wants to do a photo shoot of my truck. Absolutely. Growing up, getting in a magazine is like the biggest thing that you could aspire to do. So just the fact that this guy's even going to take pictures of my truck, I'm jumping all over this. So we go down to the end of the track. We pull off. There's like some roads next to the return road at Beach Bend, and he's shooting pictures of my truck, and like he's just talking to me about it, and I'm on cloud nine that anybody even thinks this truck is cool. And then on the way back up, he's like, "Yeah, I don't want to get your hopes up, but I'm shooting for the cover of Diesel Power right now." He's like, "I'm going to try to get your truck on the cover of it." And I was like, just man, I was so happy about that. And so right after we get done, they called us back up there, so I had to hurry up and go back up and race. Well, by this point, I've been away from my friends for so long that they all just leave and go to the sled pulls. Back then, the sled pulls were on Saturdays, and they were actually down in Frankfurt or Franklin, and you had to drive about 30 minutes to get to the pulling, and the pulling had already started because the show had ran late from the rain delay. So everybody's gone, and I'm by myself, and I go two more rounds, and I make it down to 8 trucks, and then I end up getting put out because my KSB switch that I was telling you about, that wire came off, and so what that does is that it advances timing, and so I didn't. I think I was dialed in at 460, and I think I went like a 480 or a 1485 off of a 1460. So I ended up losing. So I'm out, but I was really happy. Made it down to 8 trucks. But the biggest thing about that weekend, the most important thing about that weekend, is that's when I seen what diesel trucks really could do. That if you guys have been around diesel trucks for any amount of time, you know about Seth Sullivan. Seth Sullivan had the truck they called the Grinch, and it was the baddest truck around back then. It was ugly. It was a red uh, club cab short bed second gen truck, and it had green flames on it. And like the truck just stood out. Didn't matter if you thought it was ugly or thought it was cool, it stood out. And it had a Shied engine in it. And that year, I think it still had the cast engine in it, but I didn't know what it had in it. I just knew that this thing was bad fast. They were still running quarter mile back then. This is before any ODSS, any of that stuff. There was no sanctioned events. There was a handful of outlaw events, and he was running this class called Pro Street, and this truck went the first rip down the track. It went an 895, and I was just absolutely flabbergasted. Coming from a drag racing background to where I thought my dad had a fast car that ran 980s, seeing this full size diesel truck that at that time kind of looked like it could have drove in from there, running 890, a full second faster than my dad's purpose built race car, I was hooked right then and there. I knew that that's what I want to do.